Grace had grown up in the sleepy town of Willow Creek, Georgia, a place where everyone knew each other's names, and Sunday church bells marked the rhythm of life. She was just 16, a spirited girl with restless eyes and a tendency to question rules that never seemed fair. Her laughter often carried down the dirt roads, but so did the whispers. In a small town like Willow Creek, missteps weren't just mistakes. They were labels that could define you forever. Her parents, worn down by gossip and convinced they were saving her soul, made a decision that would change Grace's life forever. With little warning, she was sent away to St. Mary's Convent, a place spoken of in hushed tones, described as both a school and a sanctuary for wayward girls. Grace didn't know which part she feared more, the school or the sanctuary. The journey there was silent. Her father's knuckles gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight with frustration. Her mother sat stiff in the passenger seat, clutching a rosary so tightly it left marks on her palms. Grace sat in the back, staring out at the pine trees that blurred past, her chest tight with dread. She had made mistakes, sneaking out, answering back, falling in with friends her parents disapproved of. But she never imagined those small rebellions would land her here, on the road to confinement. When the convent finally came into view, it was nothing like the peaceful image the word suggested. The stone building loomed against the sky, its narrow windows like watching eyes. The iron gate groaned as it opened, swallowing their car whole. Grace's stomach turned. This didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a sentence. The nuns greeted her without warmth. Their eyes scanned her like she was a problem to be solved, a sin to be corrected. Her suitcase was taken from her hands before she could even protest. No goodbye hugs, no comforting words from her parents. Within minutes, she was led inside, swallowed by the heavy silence of the convent halls. Her first night was the hardest. The dormitory was stark, rows of beds lined up with military precision. The sheets smelled of bleach, the walls were bare, and the only decoration was a large crucifix nailed above the door. The other girls kept their eyes low, as if acknowledging her arrival might earn them punishment. Grace lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, her body stiff against the thin mattress, listening to the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. She thought of her old bedroom, the posters on the wall, the quilt her grandmother had made, and felt the first sting of homesickness cut deep into her chest. Discipline at St. Mary's was immediate and unrelenting. Each morning the bells rang at dawn, demanding obedience. The girls were marched into chapel before breakfast, their prayers monitored for enthusiasm and precision. If anyone spoke out of turn or moved too slowly, punishment followed swiftly. Grace learned quickly that silence was safer than speech, stillness safer than rebellion. But beneath the surface, she began to notice something darker. The way certain priests lingered too long near the younger girls. The way punishments were sometimes less about discipline and more about humiliation. The rules were designed not just to control behavior, but to crush spirit. Grace felt the weight of it pressing on her chest day after day, as though the convent walls themselves were closing in. She tried to remind herself that this was temporary, that one day she would be free again. Yet the days blurred together, each one filled with fear, confusion, and the quiet ache of longing for a life she might never get back. Her laughter was gone. Her questions went unasked. Each night she lay in bed, staring at the crucifix above the door, wondering if God could even hear her here, or if he had turned away too. By the end of her first month, Grace had stopped counting the days. She realized the convent had its own rhythm, one designed to erase the outside world. Letters home were read before being sent, phone calls were supervised, and visits were rare. Her parents never knew the truth of what went on behind the stone walls. But Grace knew, and though she didn't yet have the words for it, she felt the truth settling deep into her bones. St. Mary's was not a place of redemption. It was a prison dressed as salvation, and every day she remained, the more her spirit strained against the bars of silence. By the time winter settled over St. Mary's, the novelty of the convent's routines had hardened into a slow, grinding sameness. The bells still dictated our lives, rising, working, praying, sleeping, but the rhythm was less prayer and more control. Each day pressed into the next, and beneath the official piety I began to sense a pattern of secrecy. It started small, a glance that lasted too long from the rector, Father Dominic, when he walked the chapel. A hand on the shoulder that lingered under the pretext of guidance. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Convents had always been strict places. Perhaps I was misconstruing ordinary attention. But the more I watched, the more the edges of my unease sharpened. Sister Agnes, who supervised the novices, carried authority like an heirloom. Her smile did not reach her eyes, and her corrections left marks on both body and spirit. She taught us that humility was holiness, but in practice, humility meant obedience without question. Those who questioned earned the kind of discipline designed to humiliate. Long hours on cold stone, standing silently with hands outstretched, while Sister Constance counted her lashes across the floor with a ruler. The intent wasn't merely to punish, it was to teach fear. One afternoon, while carrying a tray through the kitchen, I overheard Father Dominic speaking in a low, urgent voice with Sister Veronica. They stood close, their heads bent, and the words I caught were clipped and businesslike. "We must prevent scandal," he said. "Move her to the infirmary tonight. We can manage the explanations." The way he said it, calm, decisive, chilled me. Whose scandal? Which girl? The corners of my mouth went numb. Then came the day I could no longer pretend ignorance. During evening prayers, a young novice named Lydia was called out of line. Her hands trembled as she walked forward. Her lips were white. After the service, I followed at a distance, heart pounding. I saw her disappear into the rector's small office, the heavy door closing behind them like a trap. I waited, trying to steady my breathing, but the minutes dragged. When she emerged, her blouse was buttoned wrong, her eyes hollow. She moved as though carrying a weight no child should bear. The next morning, bruises bloomed ghostly beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. When I asked if she was all right, she forced a smile that did not reach her eyes and mouthed, "It's okay." The silence in that answer echoed everywhere. Whatever had happened in that office, it was not to be spoken of. The convent had its own vocabulary for silence. For the soul's good, divine discipline, a test of devotion. The phrases sounded like prayers, but they functioned as chains. I tried to confide in Clara one night, whispering in the dim of our shared room. Her fingers squeezed mine, quick and hard. "Watch," she breathed. "Watch who goes into the rectory. Learn the schedules. Don't trust calm faces. They use kindness as cover." The simple intensity of her warning made the hair on my arms lift. We had always known danger could wear a gentle face, but seeing it confirmed was different, like discovering a crack in a mirror that reflected back the whole place as crooked. Discipline took more insidious forms, too. Confessions were no longer sacred absolution for us. They had become a mechanism for information. Fathers and some senior sisters asked questions that seemed to probe far beyond spiritual needs. Who writes letters? Who receives visitors? Which girls have family money? Details that should have been private were filed away and used like keys to open doors to punish or to hide. One night I slipped past the laundry room while returning from the chapel. The corridor smelled of starch and cold stone. Through the half-open door of the infirmary, I saw Sister Veronica and Father Dominic bending over a folded bundle on the cot. It was an emergency, they said later, an accident they had attended to. But their furtive expressions, the way they moved as if closing a book, told me there was more. Patterns were forming. Secrecy, transfer, Silence. Those moved like pieces on a chessboard, and we, novices who had once imagined sanctity, were pawns. The more I watched, the smaller I felt. The convent had constructed an invisible architecture of power, rituals that rewarded compliance, punishments that humiliated, and confessions that gathered dirt to hide it later. Even the most tender gestures were suspect. Offered bread could mean obligation. A kind word could mean leverage. Trust, once a reflex, had become a dangerous commodity. Hopelessness crept in like frost, spreading thin and slow until it reached the bones. I started waking at night with my heart hammering, replaying small interactions until I could see the pattern. The rector's unhurried steps toward a young novice, the sister's sharp glance that cut off a question in the infirmary. If I was honest with myself, I could name the feeling dread. Not the quick fear of a present danger, but a low hum of inevitability. The sense that the place itself wanted something of us, and would not stop until it had it. Yet even in the cold, a stubborn ember still glowed. Clara's calculated whispers, Rose's tiny acts of defiance, folding an extra scrap of bread into a younger girl's lap, or loosening a shoelace at just the right moment, reminded me I was not alone. The rules could bend if we learned their seams. For the first time, hopelessness and resolve sat together in my chest. I understood then that surviving St. Mary's would require more than endurance. It would demand courage, cunning, and perhaps a plan. And somewhere under the convent's watchful eyes, in the hush between prayers, I began to listen for the first smallest signs of possibility. Grace's first weeks at St. Mary's had taught her one thing: silence was safer than questions. But silence also suffocated. The girls slept in rows of iron-framed beds, each with the same gray blanket folded with military precision. Talking after lights out was forbidden, but whispers always slipped through the darkness. That's how Grace first heard the voice of Clara, a sharp-tongued girl with chestnut hair and a stubborn streak. "You breathe too loud," Clara whispered one night. From the bed to Grace's left, Grace froze. Was she being mocked? Then Clara added softly, "Don't worry, I like it. Reminds me I'm not alone." That small crack in the wall of silence was all it took. Within days, Grace found herself drawn to Clara and two others, Rose, gentle and soft-spoken, who hummed hymns under her breath when she was nervous, and Joanna, taller than most, with a laugh that burst out even when she tried to stifle it. Together they carved out a fragile island of companionship in a sea of fear. It was in the laundry room, where the steam made the air thick and the sisters' vigilance sometimes waned, that their first act of rebellion took place. Grace was folding linens when Joanna slipped her a tiny square of paper. On it, in shaky pencil, was a crude drawing, 4 girls holding hands, smiling. Grace bit back a laugh. In a place where individuality was punished, even a childish doodle felt dangerous, yet exhilarating. "Hide it," Joanna whispered. "They'll take it if they see." Grace tucked the scrap into the sleeve of her uniform, heart racing. It was the first thing she owned inside those walls that felt truly hers. As weeks bled into months, the girls developed a language of glances and half-smiles. They traded stories of home during chores, speaking in code so the nuns wouldn't notice. Grace learned that Rose had been abandoned by her aunt, that Joanna had been caught stealing bread, and that Clara's crime had been running away from a stepfather who hit her. Each story carried the same thread. None of them deserved to be here. Yet the convent painted them as sinners, lost souls in need of punishment. That lie stung worse every day. One afternoon, Sister Agnes caught Grace lingering by the chapel doors instead of scrubbing the floor. The punishment was swift, kneeling for 2 hours on raw rice scattered across the stone tiles. Grace gritted her teeth, tears burning her eyes, but she didn't cry out. When the ordeal ended, she stumbled back to her dormitory. Clara was waiting. Without a word, she pulled a rag from her pocket, damp with cool water, and pressed it to Grace's raw knees. The gesture was small, almost nothing. But in that moment, it felt like salvation. "Don't give them your tears," Clara murmured. "That's what they want." Acts of kindness soon grew bolder. Rose smuggled bits of bread from the kitchen when she could. Joanna distracted the sisters so Clara could slip chalk into Grace's hands, chalk they used to scrawl tiny symbols beneath their beds. A circle, a star, a crooked arrow, signs that they existed, that they mattered, even if no one outside those walls ever knew. Each mark was a rebellion. Each crumb of bread was defiance, but rebellion also brought danger. One evening, after Vespers, the girls dared to linger in the courtyard. The autumn air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the nearby town. Grace tilted her face to the sky, savoring the moment of freedom. That's when she noticed the fence. Beyond it, half hidden by tangled vines, was a section where the iron bars looked rusted, weaker. Her heart kicked against her ribs. Clara followed her gaze. For the briefest moment their eyes met, and Grace knew they were thinking the same thing. Could that be the way out? A spark of possibility flickered in the darkness. That night, under their gray blankets, the girls whispered about escape for the first time. Rose was terrified. Joanna joked about climbing the fence in broad daylight. Clara was serious, her voice low and steady. "We can't survive here forever. Sooner or later we try. Better to die running than rot in this place." Grace didn't speak. She only clutched the scrap of paper Joanna had given her, the 4 girls smiling, holding hands, and felt her fear twist into something else. Hope. The night we left, the convent felt smaller and larger at once. Smaller because we had studied its seams until we knew every crack. Larger because the air outside those walls seemed impossibly vast. We had planned for months in whispers and stolen glances, folding timetables and patrol routes into our memories until they became maps. Clara had marked the rusted bars by the back fence. Rose had learned the delivery schedule for the food wagon. Joanna had noticed which sisters went home on Sundays. What we lacked in resources we made up for in patience and calculation. We moved just after midnight. The chapel bell had finished its long toll, and the house was exhausted with sleep. I remember the sound of my own breath, loud in my ears, and the perfume of old wood and dust. We left one by one, Clara slipping out of the laundry door with a basket as cover, Rose pretending to fetch water, Joanna hurrying after a late errand. I followed last, heart hammering so hard it felt like an animal trying to escape my ribs. The servant passage Clara had found smelled of damp and old stone. It was narrow, the ceiling low enough that we had to stoop. Every footstep sounded enormous. For a while we crawled, then walked, then ran when the tunnel spat us out near the back garden. The cold night air struck my face and I tasted freedom, just for a second, before the fear returned in a fresh, sharper form. The rusted section of fence was just where Clara had said it would be, flaking iron that begged to be climbed. Clara went first, nimble despite her thin frame, and when she reached the top, she hoisted herself over and dropped silently into the shadow beyond. Rose followed, then Joanna, then me. For one terrible moment my foot slipped on the rust, and I thought we were lost, that the clang of metal would wake the convent and bring down a thunder of voices. My heart screamed, but a hand, Clara's, grabbed my sleeve and pulled me up. We tumbled into the underbrush on the other side, breathless and filthy and alive. We ran until our legs burned and the convent was only a dark silhouette behind us. The world felt suddenly enormous and indifferent. A low country road, the whisper of pines, a single farmhouse light here and there. We hid in ditches and lay perfectly still until dawn brushed the sky with gray. In those long hours between panic and daylight, I learned something. Adrenaline is not a single feeling. It changes. Sometimes it makes you sharp and brave. Sometimes it leaves you shaking and hollow. I felt both. I had never known my hands could tremble from relief. By morning, the road led us to the edge of the city, the wide, unapologetic streets of Atlanta. The skyline rose like a different language, glass and steel instead of stone and stained glass. For the first time in months, the air smelled of oil and bakery ovens and someone else's smoking cigarette. It hit me like a tide. We had actually left. The reality buckled my knees, and I sat on the curb for a long minute, watching strangers move past, unaware that the small cluster of ragged girls on the corner had survived something no one in this city could imagine. The city did not cradle us. It demanded we learn quickly. Clara pushed us toward a small women's shelter she had heard of, run by volunteers who took in those who had nowhere else. The shelter's door was different from the convent's, open, a warm light spilling out. Inside, women who had known hard things moved with soft confidence. They gave us soup, blankets, and the first unguarded smiles we had received in ages. I cried into my hands as the steam from the bowl warmed my face. The tears tasted like metal and relief. We told fragments at first, bare facts, the kind that could not be disproven. The volunteers listened and asked practical questions, names, ages, if we had any documents. They never asked us to relive details we weren't ready to speak. When Rose missed a meal because the memory had returned too sharp, a woman named Mara sat with her and hummed until the shaking subsided. When Joanna woke screaming from nightmares, another volunteer took her into a quiet room and braided her hair until she slept again. Freedom, I discovered, was complicated. The absence of bells did not mean the absence of fear. At night, when the city hummed and the shelter breathed, I would wake and expect the sharp rap of Sister Agnes's cane on the floor. I would flinch at a raised voice. My hands went to my sleeves to cover invisible bruises. I had escaped one prison, but my body still remembered the architecture of punishment. Where to fold my hands, how low to bow my head, when not to speak. Yet there were small victories that felt enormous. We walked to a market and tasted oranges that dripped sticky juice down our chins. We laughed, halting and then freer, about foolish things we had once taken for granted. Clara found odd jobs, washing dishes, stacking boxes, work that paid a few dollars and, more importantly, let us feel the dignity of exchange rather than command. Rose got paper and pencil from a volunteer and drew crude images of the garden at St. Mary's, alongside scenes of a house with a painted swing. Joanna learned to hum a tune that wasn't a hymn, and it sounded like sunlight. And then there was the eerie closeness to danger. A phone call one evening made my stomach drop. An unknown voice had asked for a Clara by name at a payphone near the shelter. The shelter tightened its security. Volunteers accompanied us in public. We stopped giving out details of where we slept. The world outside the convent had enemies too. Power and shame could still find us in the city. Our escape had not closed the book. It had merely started a different chapter, one where caution and courage had to live together. In those first weeks, nights were the hardest. The quiet allowed memory to creep in and take up residence. But day by day, the sharp edges dulled. We began to sleep a little longer, to let laughter surface without immediately checking for danger. The city taught us new rhythms. The clatter of a streetcar, the shout of a vendor, the way the light fell on a window at noon. Slowly, among strangers, we learned to be human again. As we stood one morning at the edge of a park, watching children run and an old man feed pigeons, I felt the old tightness in my chest loosen. We had crossed the fence, crawled through darkness, and arrived in a place that did not demand our obedience. I had escaped the convent, yes. But more than that, for the first time in a long time, I could imagine a life that belonged to me. The thought, fragile and trembling, was enough to keep me moving forward. Atlanta did not erase the past, but it gave us a stage on which to rebuild. At the shelter, weeks folded into months, and the bruises on our hearts faded at a slower pace than the bruises on our skin. Each of us found new rhythms. Clara learned bookkeeping through a volunteer program. Rose picked up sewing lessons, and Joanna, always the most withdrawn, began to write in a little notebook she carried everywhere. I, too, searched for a foothold, some way to make sense of what had happened, some way to fight back against the silence that followed us like a shadow. It was there, in the hum of the city and the fragile safety of the shelter, that I met John Whitaker. He wasn't a volunteer, not in the official sense. He was a journalist for the Atlanta Journal, a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and a stubborn streak that seemed to have been forged in the fire of chasing hard truths. He had come to the shelter following a tip about labor abuses in local factories, but when he saw me reading a battered copy of the Scarlet Letter, he struck up a conversation. At first I avoided him. Men had been the face of control, of punishment, of betrayal. But John's persistence wasn't pushy, it was patient. He asked questions with care, and when I said no, he didn't press. Weeks later, when I finally told him where I had come from, he didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with fury, not directed at me, but at the system that had failed me. "You should tell your story," he said one evening, his voice steady, almost solemn. "Not just for yourself, but for the others still there." The thought terrified me. Speaking out meant exposure, risk, but it also stirred something inside. A spark I had nearly forgotten. If silence had been the convent's weapon, maybe words could be mine. With John's guidance, I began to write. Not everything at once, small pieces, fragments of memory I could bear to place on paper. The first draft read like broken glass, sharp and uneven. John helped me shape it into a narrative that others could follow. He didn't polish the horror away. He preserved its edges, so readers could feel what I had felt. When the article was published in the Atlanta Journal, it ran under the headline, "The morning it hit newsstands, I couldn't breathe." I sat at the kitchen table in the shelter, fingers clenched around the paper, bracing for disbelief, ridicule, or worse. But as the hours passed, something else happened. The shelter's phone began to ring, not with threats but with voices. The first was a woman from Savannah. She had been at St. Mary's 20 years earlier. Her voice shook as she thanked me. The second call was from a man whose sister had disappeared after being sent to the convent. He asked if he could meet me just to hear my account. Then letters began to arrive, envelopes addressed simply to Grace, Atlanta Journal. Some contained only a few sentences. I thought I was the only one, while others stretched into pages of grief and relief poured onto paper. I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed. Each one was proof I was not alone, and what I remembered was not imagined. The convent's cruelty had left a trail that stretched across states, decades, and countless broken lives. For the first time, I felt something other than shame tethered to my past. I felt power. Of course, the backlash came too. Anonymous letters accusing me of lying, of trying to destroy the church. A stern-faced man in a gray suit appeared at the shelter one afternoon, demanding to know who had put me up to this. The shelter staff escorted him out, but the chill of his presence lingered. Still, the support outweighed the threats, and with John at my side, I found courage I hadn't thought possible. It wasn't long before John and I became more than allies. The closeness grew quietly, in small moments. Him walking me home from the newsroom after dark, his hand brushing mine when I faltered, the way his laugh, deep and unguarded, could cut through even my darkest memories. When he asked one evening if I trusted him, I surprised myself by saying yes without hesitation. Trust had been a foreign language for so long, yet with John I spoke it fluently. the article sparked something larger than us. Local pastors reached out, demanding answers from the archdiocese. A women's rights group offered legal assistance. Volunteers at the shelter began discussing the idea of a formal refuge, a place not just for food and beds, but for healing and advocacy. One evening, Rose came into our shared room holding a letter with shaking hands. "She says she remembers me," she whispered, eyes wide. "One of the girls who left before. She thought I was dead." Her voice cracked, and I pulled her close. That moment sealed what we already knew. Our stories mattered, not just for us, but for every girl whose voice had been taken. The fight for justice was far from easy, but it had begun. And for the first time since I had stepped foot inside St. Mary's, I could see a line stretching forward, not just a desperate attempt to survive, but a path toward something bigger. Our small victories were fragile, like seedlings in a storm, but they were victories nonetheless. Each letter, each survivor who stepped forward, each ally who believed us, they were bricks laid against the wall of silence. And with every brick, I felt the convent's hold on me loosen, just a little more. The story had escaped into the world. Now it could never be silenced again. The audience feels the tide turning. Grace's voice is no longer just her own. The letters, the allies, and John's presence hint at a larger movement forming, while danger still lurks in the shadows. The question hangs: will their small victories be enough to stand against the powerful forces determined to silence them? The idea for Hope House didn't arrive fully formed. It began in whispers, in late-night conversations at the shelter when sleep refused to come. Rose would say, "If only there was a place where girls like us didn't have to start from nothing." And Joanna would nod, scribbling in her notebook. I would think of the letters piled high in my shoebox, each one a cry for help. And I knew we couldn't stop with just telling our story. The first step was small. Renting a weathered 2-story house on the edge of Atlanta, with John's help, and the donations that trickled in after my article. The siding was peeling, the roof leaked when it rained, and the floorboards groaned under every step. But to us it was a fortress of possibility. We scrubbed the walls, painted the bedrooms in bright colors, and scrounged furniture from thrift shops and church basements. We gave it a name that carried both memory and promise: Hope House. The mission was simple but radical. No girl would ever walk alone into silence again. Survivors could come here for a bed, a warm meal, and, more importantly, someone who believed them without hesitation. We kept the doors open late, left the porch light on as a beacon. The first girl arrived just 2 weeks after we opened. A pale slip of a child no older than 14. She barely spoke, but when Rose wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and whispered, "You're safe here," the tears came in waves. Soon, the house filled with voices. Some were sharp with anger, others soft with shame. We sat around the kitchen table and let them speak, no matter how jagged or broken the words were. Clara taught bookkeeping to the older girls. Rose taught sewing, turning scraps into dresses. Joanna led small writing sessions, encouraging the others to pour memories onto paper as she had done. I worked with John to connect survivors with lawyers and doctors willing to help quietly. It wasn't perfect. Trauma doesn't dissolve with paint and kindness. Nightmares stalk the halls. Screams sometimes pierce the dark. One girl bolted in the middle of the night, too afraid to stay. Another sat mute for weeks, refusing to eat. But for every setback, there were breakthroughs. The first laugh of a girl who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. The tentative steps of another toward education. The relief in a mother's eyes when she realized her daughter was alive and recovering. Hope House grew into more than shelter. It became a symbol. Churches sent donations of food and clothes. University students volunteered to tutor. Lawyers, emboldened by growing attention, offered pro bono services. Survivors began to arrive from farther away. clutching newspaper clippings with my story. Every new arrival reminded us that the convent's shadow stretched wider than we'd feared, but also that our light was reaching farther than we'd hoped. Of course, the convent and its allies noticed. The pushback came swiftly, cloaked in polite words and legal threats. Letters from the archdiocese claimed we were defaming the good name of the church. Anonymous callers left messages dripping with menace. "You'll regret this. Stop while you can." One evening, we returned from the market to find the front windows of Hope House shattered, glass sparkling like tears across the floor. I wanted to fold under the weight of it, but the girls, those who had been silenced for so long, stood taller. "They're afraid of us," Joanna said simply as she swept shards into a dustpan. "That means we're winning." Still, fear coiled in my stomach. I had seen what power could do when threatened. We installed locks, partnered with police officers sympathetic to our cause, and trained the girls in basic safety measures. At night, I lay awake listening for footsteps outside. Danger was no longer behind convent walls. It was here, pressing at our door. And yet, even as threats loomed, hope expanded. We hosted small community gatherings, art shows of the girls' paintings, poetry readings from Joanna's notebook. People came, sometimes curious, sometimes skeptical, but they left moved. One painting in particular stayed with me. A girl had drawn a cracked stone wall with flowers forcing their way through the breaks. She titled it "We Grow Anyway." The image became our unofficial emblem. It appeared on flyers, on pamphlets we handed out at churches and schools. It told our story in a single phrase: resilience in the face of oppression. John was with me every step, documenting our journey carefully. He urged me to see that what we were building wasn't just a safe house, it was a movement. "Every girl who walks through that door is proof," he said one night as we locked up. "Proof that silence is breaking. Proof that you're not just surviving, Grace, you're leading." His words both frightened and strengthened me. Leadership had never been my dream. I had only wanted freedom. But now freedom meant carrying others with me. And though the burden was heavy, there was also joy in it. Joy in watching girls who had once been voiceless find their voices and use them like weapons of light. The dangers grew sharper with each success, but so did our determination. The archdiocese could try to bury us under threats and lawsuits, but the truth was already seeping into the cracks of their carefully constructed facade. For every brick they stacked, a flower bloomed through. Hope House was no longer just a refuge. It was a declaration, and though I trembled at times, I knew we had crossed a line we could never step back over. The audience feels both uplifted and uneasy. Hope House shines as a beacon, but the threats against it grow darker. The stakes have risen. This is no longer about survival alone, but about defiance against powerful forces. The viewer is left wondering, will Hope House withstand the storm that's coming? The courtroom always smelled the same, like old paper and polished wood, with an undercurrent of something stale, like secrets left too long unspoken. Grace had dreamed of this place being the ground where truth finally triumphed. But she quickly learned the law didn't bend easily toward justice. The first lawsuit against St. Mary's Convent was filed in 1985. Grace, Rose, and Joanna walked into the courthouse with nervous hope. Their attorney, a steady man named Paul Kessler, warned them, "They will deny. They will stall. They will try to crush you before this even begins." He was right. Within weeks, the archdiocese's lawyers filed motions to dismiss. They argued that the statute of limitations had long since passed, that the convent had acted only in pastoral concern, that memories from girls were unreliable and influenced. Each phrase was like a slap across the face. Grace clenched her fists during hearings, biting her tongue as men in expensive suits dissected her pain like it was a technical error. One lawyer leaned close across the table once and said, low enough only she could hear, "You'll never win. Walk away now." But Grace had walked away before. She wasn't doing it again. The setbacks came in waves. Evidence vanished mysteriously, files the convent was supposed to provide suddenly could not be located. Rose's sworn testimony was ruled inadmissible due to inconsistencies, even though those inconsistencies were the result of years of trauma and fear. Then came the most crushing blow, Clara. The friend who had once whispered plans of escape in the convent's laundry room refused to testify. Grace couldn't blame her. Clara was terrified, living quietly under a new name, desperate to never be dragged into the public eye. But when the judge struck down Clara's affidavit, Grace felt her stomach sink. At night, back at Hope House, Grace would sit at the kitchen table with case files spread around her, head in her hands. John tried to encourage her. He'd bring her tea, place a steady hand on her shoulder. But there were nights when she couldn't find the strength to look him in the eye. "Maybe they're right," she whispered once. "Maybe we can't win against all of this." John didn't flinch. "Then we lose fighting. That's better than silence." The media began to circle, but coverage was mixed. Local papers ran cautious headlines. Former convent girls allege abuse. Some reporters treated Grace with sympathy. Others implied she was seeking money or attention. A columnist even wrote, "These so-called victims should stop dragging good priests through the mud." Grace clipped the article and pinned it above her desk. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of the mountain still to climb. But the pressure was relentless. Anonymous phone calls at night. A brick thrown through the Hope House window. Rose once found a note on her windshield that read, "Liars burn in hell." The girls at Hope House were frightened. Grace gathered them one evening, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. "They want us afraid. That's the only power they have left. If we let them scare us into silence, then they've already won." Still, the courts offered no mercy. In 1987, the first case was officially dismissed. Grace sat in the back of the courtroom, her pulse hammering, as the judge declared, "Insufficient evidence. Motion to dismiss granted." The gavel struck, and it felt like the sound of a door slamming forever shut. Outside, reporters crowded around. Cameras flashed. "Miss Miller, do you have any comment?" Grace opened her mouth, but for once no words came. Rose grabbed her hand, grounding her. They walked past the cameras in silence, their dignity the only weapon they had left. That night, Grace collapsed on her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this fight was only breaking her further apart. She thought of the girls at Hope House, the fragile trust they placed in her. What if she was leading them into a battle they couldn't win? And yet, just when defeat felt permanent, a small ember glowed. In the mail one morning came a thick envelope. Inside were letters, handwritten, typed, some scrawled on lined notebook paper. Dozens of them. Women from across the state, even across the country, writing. "I was there too. They told me to keep quiet. I thought I was the only one." Grace sat at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, reading each word. For every legal setback, there was this undeniable truth. They were not alone. The legal battle dragged on through the late 1980s, each year marked by more delays, more dismissals, more appeals. Paul Kessler aged 10 years in 5, but he never abandoned the case. "They're waiting for you to give up," he told Grace. "Don't." And she didn't. Even as she carried the scars of defeat, Grace found herself fueled by the growing chorus of survivors who wrote, who called, who sometimes arrived trembling at the door of Hope House. She realized the courtroom might never give her justice, but her voice, their voices, were already reshaping the world outside it. The convent might win motions and dismissals. But in the quiet corners of kitchens and bedrooms across America, Survivors were beginning to whisper their truths aloud, and those whispers, Grace knew, would someday become a roar. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air the day Rose slid a battered cardboard box across the Hope House kitchen table. "It was in the storage room," she whispered, her eyes darting as though the walls might be listening. Inside were diaries, small, leather-bound, frayed at the edges. Some belonged to nuns, others to girls who had once lived within the convent walls. Rose's hands shook as she opened the first one, the ink faded but legible. Grace leaned over her shoulder, heart pounding. The words on the page were not prayers. They were records, detailed accounts of punishments, beatings, even names of priests who supervised the discipline. One line froze Grace in place. "Sister Agnes says the silence of the girls is a holy silence. Father Anselm says it is the silence that protects us all." The silence, the very weapon that had nearly destroyed them. Paul Kessler, their lawyer, nearly dropped his glasses when Grace laid the diaries on his desk. "Do you realize what this is?" His voice trembled, a mixture of awe and fear. "These aren't just testimonies. These are their own words, written in their own hands. This could break everything open." But Paul also warned them, "This makes you dangerous to them now. Expect them to come after you harder than ever before." And they did. Anonymous letters began arriving at Hope House, some vile, accusing them of blasphemy, others chillingly precise about their movements. "We know where you live," one note read. Grace felt her stomach tighten when she realized it had been slipped under their front door in the middle of the night. Despite the threats, the diaries changed everything. Local journalists who had once been cautious now leaned in closer. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran the first major story. Convent diaries reveal pattern of abuse. Within a week, the piece was picked up nationally. Grace woke one morning to find television vans parked outside Hope House, satellite dishes angled toward the sky. The air buzzed with voices, cameras, microphones. When she stepped onto the porch, a reporter shouted, "Grace, do you believe the church covered this up?" She froze, the weight of every survivor's hope pressing down on her shoulders. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Then she said, steady and firm, "I don't just believe it. I lived it, and we're not silent anymore." The clip aired on evening news across the country. Overnight, Grace became the face of the movement she had once only dreamed might exist. But empowerment came at a personal cost. Grace was 3 months pregnant by then, the curve of new life just beginning to show beneath her blouse. At night, lying awake beside John, she pressed a hand against her stomach, torn between fear and hope. "What if they come after us harder?" she whispered. John brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then we fight harder. For you, for this child, for all of them." Grace wanted to believe him. But sometimes, the weight of carrying both a baby and a movement felt like too much for one body to bear. The diaries triggered a storm of confessions. Former convent girls wrote letters, sent copies of old journals, even showed up trembling at Hope House's front door. One young woman, barely in her 20s, handed Grace a folded piece of notebook paper and whispered, "I can't go on without saying it. I was there too." Grace read the words later and sobbed, not just for the pain written there, but for the courage it had taken to write them. Every new testimony was like another stone added to a foundation that could no longer be ignored. And then came the most shocking piece. One diary, written not by a girl, but by Sister Constance, the nun who had once shown Grace fleeting moments of kindness in the convent halls. Her words were a confession, torn between obedience and guilt. "I fear we are complicit in something unholy. Yet I am too weak to resist. Forgive me, God, for the silence I have kept." For Grace, it was both heartbreak and vindication. Sister Constance had been human, trapped too. and now her words gave them a weapon stronger than any courtroom technicality. The church doubled down. A spokesman for the archdiocese went on national television, calling the diaries fabrications, taken out of context by bitter women seeking to destroy the faith. Watching him, Grace felt her blood boil. How many times would they smear survivors rather than face the truth? Still, the tide was turning. For the first time, politicians spoke openly, calling for independent investigations into church institutions. Talk shows debated the Convent diaries night after night. Grace was invited onto panels, her face appearing alongside bold letters, "Survivors speak out." But each victory carried danger. The threats grew sharper. Rose's car was vandalized. Joanna received phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing on the other end. Grace herself found a dead bird left on the steps of Hope House, its wings pinned open. She clutched her belly tighter each day, silently promising her unborn child, "I will keep you safe. I will not let them win." The turning point came during a televised interview. Sitting under hot studio lights, Grace was asked by the host, "What do you say to those who still don't believe you?" She looked directly into the camera, her voice steady. "I say silence only protects the abuser. Every voice that speaks out brings healing, even if you're afraid, even if it shakes. Speak." Millions of viewers heard those words. Thousands wrote letters. Donations to Hope House tripled in a week. Survivors across the country whispered to themselves, "If she can, maybe I can too." Grace left the studio that night with cameras still flashing, her heart pounding. She knew the fight was far from over. The church still held power. The courts were still unforgiving, and shadows still lingered outside her door. But for the first time, she felt the balance shift. The truth was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the world now, and once spoken, it could never be buried again. The halls of Hope House no longer echoed with silence, but with life. Laughter drifted from art rooms where girls painted bright colors across wide canvases. Soft music carried down hallways as survivors learned to play guitar, violin, even piano. Therapy sessions ended in tearful hugs. What began as a single house in Atlanta had grown into a movement. Within 5 years, Hope House expanded into 2 additional locations, one in Nashville, another in Raleigh. Volunteers poured in. Former convent survivors came not just for shelter, but to lead workshops. Together, they were rebuilding lives out of pieces once meant to be forgotten. Grace sat in a sunlit room one afternoon, flipping through the pages of their first published book, Voices of Silence. Inside were poems, essays, and confessions written by survivors. Words that had once been secrets were now printed in ink, held by strangers across the country. "This isn't just our story anymore," Grace whispered to John, who sat beside her. "It belongs to everyone." But with attention came consequences. As the Convent diaries case pressed forward, courtrooms filled with survivors ready to testify. Journalists crowded every hearing. Documents once hidden in locked church basements were subpoenaed. And then, the unthinkable happened. News broke one morning that Father Anselm, once the towering figure of St. Mary's, feared by all the girls, had taken his own life. His body was found in a rectory office, a single sheet of paper on his desk. The note read simply, "Forgive me. I was wrong." Grace read the headline in stunned silence. For years, she had imagined facing him across a courtroom, finally forcing him to answer for the horrors he inflicted. Now he was gone. Rose sat down heavily across from her. "It feels like—" "He escaped," Grace shook her head slowly. "No." This time his silence speaks louder than his words ever did. The world knows what he was. The shock rippled through the nation. For some, his suicide was seen as proof of guilt. For others, it was an attempt to shield the institution from a public trial. Either way, the facade of untouchable power had cracked. One by one, other officials were forced into the light. Sister Agnes, once the iron fist of discipline, was cross-examined on national television. She stammered under oath, denying what survivors said, but her own handwriting in the diaries betrayed her. Former nuns who had once stayed silent came forward too, their testimonies trembling but resolute. Sister Constance's diary pages, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, struck a chord with millions. Readers saw not just cruelty, but the crushing weight of obedience. They saw how even those inside the system were prisoners too. The nation could no longer look away. Amid the storm of court hearings and news reports, Grace's life was changing in quieter, more personal ways. In late spring, she went into labor. Hours later, as the morning sun lit the hospital blinds, Grace held her son in her arms. Peter. The name felt like a prayer, a new beginning. His tiny fingers curled around hers and tears filled her eyes. John kissed her forehead, whispering, "He's proof that life grows where they tried to plant death." Grace nodded, cradling Peter closer. For every girl who hadn't made it out, for every voice silenced too soon, Peter was a symbol that their suffering had not been in vain. When Grace returned home, the community welcomed her with flowers, cards, and endless embraces. Survivors who visited Hope House would lean down to look at Peter and smile through tears. "He's our child, too," one whispered. In those moments, Grace understood something deeper. The movement wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about securing the future, for her son, for every survivor's children, for generations to come. Public recognition followed. Grace and her friends were invited to speak at universities, to open art exhibitions showcasing survivors' paintings, to lead discussions on trauma and healing. Hope House became more than a shelter. It became a symbol. At one exhibition in New York, Grace walked through rows of paintings. Some showed dark convent corridors, others bursting suns and open fields. Each piece carried a story of pain and rebirth. Standing before a painting of a broken chain painted by a young survivor, Grace whispered, "We're free." The exhibition drew thousands. Newspapers ran glowing reviews. Survivors across the country wrote letters, saying they had finally found the courage to share their own stories. The trials stretched on for years, but slowly, brick by brick, the wall of silence collapsed. Settlements were reached, officials removed, investigations launched in other states, and though the church never fully admitted its guilt, the world had heard the truth. Grace never forgot the feeling of walking into that courtroom, holding Peter's small hand as cameras flashed. She looked at the rows of survivors seated behind her, and for the first time, she did not feel small. She felt the strength of thousands. The past had nearly destroyed her. But the future, her son's future, was theirs to build. By the end of the decade, Hope House stood as a national model for survivor advocacy. Its motto, painted in bold letters across the lobby wall, read, "A voice, however shaky, still carries." And as Peter grew, toddling through those same halls where women once whispered their first confessions, Grace knew he was walking on ground built from courage and resilience. The darkness of the convent had cast a long shadow. But in its wake, survivors had created something the abusers never imagined possible, a legacy of strength, justice, and life. More than 20 years had passed since Grace first stepped through the iron gates of St. Mary's. Now, as she sat quietly in the courtyard of Hope House, she watched her son Peter, no longer a child, but a grown man, speaking to a group of young volunteers. His voice carried the same conviction she had once struggled to find. He spoke not only as her son, but as someone who understood what survival meant, even if he had not lived through the convent walls himself. Grace smiled. This is what survival looks like when it blooms across generations, she thought. Hope House had grown far beyond what she and her friends once dreamed. It was now a national model. Centers across the country, a network of advocacy programs, even government recognition. Their art therapy programs were studied in universities. Their book, Voices of Silence, had been translated into 6 languages. But the part that mattered most wasn't the fame or recognition. It was the letters. Decades later, the letters still came. Survivors, old, young, scattered across the world, still wrote, "Because of you, I finally spoke." One autumn afternoon, Grace received an invitation. The envelope bore the seal of the archdiocese, though the handwriting was careful, almost nervous. Inside was a letter inviting her back to Willow Creek. The convent had been closed for years, abandoned after the lawsuits and revelations. But now it had been transformed. The grounds where silence once ruled had been reborn as the Sister Constant Center for Healing and Justice, a space dedicated to survivors of institutional abuse. Grace hesitated for days before deciding. Finally, with Peter at her side, she returned. The drive felt like moving backward through time. When she stepped out of the car, the sight of the old stone wall sent a shiver through her. The same archway where she had once entered as a frightened teenager now bore a new inscription carved into marble. Here, silence was broken. Inside, the darkness was gone. Bright windows had been opened. The rooms where girls once knelt in punishment now held art, sculptures, and photographs. Survivors had reclaimed the space, leaving their mark on every wall. Grace walked slowly through the corridors, her hand brushing the stone. She could almost hear the echoes of footsteps, the whispers of prayers forced through trembling lips. But this time, she wasn't afraid. At the far end of the main hall stood a plaque. Peter stopped beside her as Grace read the inscription. It listed names. Hundreds of them. Every known survivor of St. Mary's carved into bronze. For some, only first names remained. For others, initials. But each one was honored, remembered. Grace's own name was there too. She traced it with her fingertips, a flood of memories rushing back. Rose, Joanna, Clara, Sister Constance, all there. She felt her chest tighten, tears threatening. For so long she had feared that their stories would vanish, buried in silence. But here they were, etched in permanence, undeniable, untouchable. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom," he said softly, This is your legacy. All of this." Grace looked around, at the survivors gathered for the dedication ceremony, at the young children playing in the courtyard beyond the windows. She realized Peter was wrong. "It isn't mine," she whispered. "It's ours. Every girl who refused to stay silent, every voice that joined." When she turned back to the plaque, her reflection shimmered faintly on the bronze surface. She didn't see the frightened girl who once longed for freedom. She saw a woman who had carried the weight of silence and broken it open. As the ceremony ended, Grace stepped forward to speak. Her voice was steady, though emotion trembled beneath it. "People often ask me what gave me the strength to survive. The truth is, I didn't do it alone. None of us did. We survived because we found each other, because we refused to let silence have the final word." She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd. Survivors, children, volunteers, all listening. And then, with Peter standing tall beside her, she gave them the words she had carried for decades. Silence only protects the abuser. A voice, however shaky, has the power to heal. The room fell into quiet, not of fear, but of reverence. This time, silence was no longer their enemy. It was their strength, the pause before the applause, the moment where every survivor felt the weight of her words settle inside their own hearts. And in that silence, Grace knew the story was no longer hers to carry. It belonged to everyone.